While we're only 3 months into Street Fighter 6's lifespan, there has already been plenty of discussion and conversations about balance changes to the game. And while not totally unwarranted, I often find conversations regarding balance changes and character strengths to be rather exhausting. Oftentimes, players aren't looking to be objective on characters and how they're designed and what they're designed to do. Their intended strengths, their flaws and weaknesses, where they excel and where they're obviously not supposed to be strong but are anyways. So often that this part of the discussion gets drowned out by these ridiculous and nonsensical takes imaginable on Twitter.com. But my goal isn't really to talk about my personal hot or freezing cold takes, but rather ask the important question: should fighting games be patched as infrequently as they are now? Should the updates be more frequent or even reactive to the current discourse that is happening? Now, the typical patch cadence for fighting games I've been part of is usually 1 to 2 times a year. And coming from any other genre, this is remarkably slow. Typically in modern competitive games, patches are delivered within a live service model, happening every 1 to 3 months depending on the game. And while patches might provide a new battle pass, skins, and potentially new features, an adjustment to the game's balance is always expected by the player base, regardless of size. Sometimes these changes are quite dramatic, or they will slightly nudge the meta into a particular direction. Not only that, but in certain titles, players can expect hotfixes to the game to tweak balance. Some games are so aggressive they may even hotfix on a weekly basis to address perceived issues with the game. Now, while these changes may work for other genres, fighting games are inherently different. Simply put, fighting games take longer to solve. Let's take a card game, for example, for the idea of more rapid fire changes, which is like hotfixes or potentially basically doing a balance patch maybe once a month. While players will try to find new and interesting ways to express themselves, oftentimes within a new expansion, it takes about 1 to 2 weeks to kind of figure out what are the best decks in the game. While harder and more complex builds will take longer to figure out how to properly pilot, the meta is essentially solved and won't effectively change until there's some sort of intervention by the developers, like new cards, formats, or balance changes. In turn, fighting games are essentially just harder to solve. While effective strategies will present themselves, it takes a longer period of experimentation and analysis to truly figure out how the game should be approached and played. Not only that, but strengths of characters and where they're placed on a tier list can often be incorrect and require significantly more time to assess. Even in Street Fighter 6, we recently had 2 perceived weaker characters, Kimberly and Zangief, win major events with strong notable players in them. And while this could easily lead to a discussion about modern fighting games and the power level of characters, or players versus the characters, that's not the point of this video. To return to the main objective, due to these factors mentioned earlier, such rapid fire changes and hotfixing just wouldn't work for the title, and just wouldn't work for fighting games in general. They just aren't solved fast enough, and players need time to digest changes in a meaningful way. With that established, what about a quarterly approach for fighting games? As mentioned by Capcom, they will be doing a rank reset specifically for Masters players related to their Master rank, aka MR. This in theory could provide Capcom with time to assess the meta through these few months of data collection, both in higher level rank play or competitive tournaments. It would also allow the game to change more frequently to keep things feeling a little bit fresh by allowing weaker characters to shine and tone down stronger characters just a peg. My initial thoughts are really rather simple about this. Great in theory, but difficult to accept. While I truly believe players would be able to adjust to these changes in a meaningful way, 3 months in the world of fighting game doesn't feel like a lot of time depending on how large the changes are. The last thing you would want to do is to force players to relearn routing, pressure sequences, and just neutral interactions in general, so often that they would become exhausting. And while this may not affect every single player, it would also encourage top players to pick patch characters, pick the strongest character that's easy to pick up, and run with them until the new balance patch. And just as a caveat, you could technically apply this logic to any sort of patch cycle, but I digress. The best way to avoid this issue would be to make small scale changes if you were to approach the fighting game with this particular model. The first 4 quarters, make adjustments to nudge characters in the perceived right direction, and the new season will approach and you can start making your more drastic changes. Lastly, the one other model I want to mention that's different from the annual model is really the semi-annual model, basically every 6 months, which is, to be frank, it's somewhat common among some developers. Guilty Gear Strive doing about 2 balance patches pretty much. My core issue usually is how it's done. From my personal opinion, the first patch should be larger and focus on bringing characters up to speed, buffs over nerfing. And while I don't truly believe in the idea of never nerf characters, or you should always buff more than you should nerf, the first patch in a model should be evaluating the current state of the game, how players interact with the system, and what characters aren't really using the mechanics particularly well, or to get people into the win condition more often, more reserved, and to take out more egregious tools that shouldn't belong in order to shift balance. And the new patch afterwards should be the upcoming season, should focus on more core adjustments to the game and the system mechanics. And while my balance ideas may not be the norm, the model is typical. It works as intended and leaves players happy, while others may be frustrated that the characters didn't receive the love they needed. In these situations, they must wait another 6 months before the character has any sort of meaningful change whatsoever, which at the end of the day is the core problem with these semi-annual or annual balance changes. The response is incredibly slow, and the idea of, as mentioned earlier, of having a quote-unquote patched character will shift players away from what they want to play into what they feel like they must play in order to have a competitive edge, regardless of what skill level they're in. It doesn't really matter if you're not competing at a high rank or if you're not competing tournaments. A lot of players will feel that their character is to blame regardless of skill, which is a whole different conversation altogether. So realistically, they all have their benefits and they all have their problems. Changing the game too frequently will be a chaotic mess and difficult to keep up with. A quarterly basis with smaller changes could keep the game fresh, but overstepping will cause reasonable frustration. And a slower approach is, well, just the norm. Weaker characters may not get the love that they need, and they just feel locked out in some players' mind. Personally, from my opinion, I would love a quarterly approach to not just Street Fighter, but just fighting games in general. By just having the attention of the developers to really get them to make more changes more frequently, I think it would just make for a more, generally speaking, enjoyable experience. I think the only real downside to this would be the annoying discourse on Twitter every single time, every week, because people will know a balance patch is coming up soon. They think they're influencing the developer's mind when realistically they're just making white noise on the internet. Anyway, what do you guys think? What would you guys like? What type of model would you really appreciate? Should we have a more modernized model like we see in other competitive games outside of the fighting game space, or should we stick to something that's slower pace because of how different fighting games are? Let me know. Like, comment, subscribe, you know the YouTube stuff, and I'll see you next time. This has been Beta. Peace.